On July 31st, 1999, 17-year-old high school seniors and best friends J.B. Beasley and Tracy Halbach began their journey from their hometown of Dothan, Alabama. They were headed towards a birthday party for J.B. in Headland, Alabama, but the girls ended up getting lost along the way. In a phone call to her mother from Ozark around 11:30 p.m., Tracy informed her mom that they were heading back home. However, neither girl would ever make it home. Their lifeless bodies would be found the next day in the trunk of their car, raising the long-debated question of what might have happened to them. Did it have something to do with the party? Or did the girls run into trouble on the road heading back from Ozark? Located in southeast Alabama near the Florida border, Ozark is known as the home of Fort Rucker. Situated in the heart of Dale County, it's a typical charming southern town, home to nearly 15,000 people. It's a nice place for both raising a family and spending retirement years. However, the town was not the sort of place to hit the headlines until the gruesome double homicide of two high school seniors in 1999, which baffled the community for years to come. J.B. Hilton Green Beasley was born on July 31, 1981, to parents Cheryl and Hilton Lanier Beasley in Troy, Alabama. After her parents separated, she moved to Dothan with her mother in 1984. She was adored by her mother, as well as her stepfather Joey Bagnoni, whom her mother married after a few years. She grew up in a nice home in Dothan, along with her four sisters. J.B. grew up to be a very outgoing girl who was involved in various activities, including cheerleading, dance, piano, and swimming. She even modeled for several agencies, along with her sisters. Besides all of her hobbies, she loved hanging out with her friends and family. It was in high school where J.B. met her fellow cheerleader Tracy Halbach, and the two did not take long to become best friends. Tracy Jean Halbach was born on March 3, 1982, to parents Carolyn and Robert Halbach. Unfortunately, her father, who worked in the Dothan Police Department, died when Tracy was only 5 years old. Her mother later remarried a man named Mike Roberts, who helped raise Tracy along with her mother. Unlike J.B., Tracy was a bit shy but never hesitated to put people before herself. She was also very protective of her two brothers, who were much younger than her. Even at a young age, she was a responsible older sister. Tracy also attended Northview High School and regularly received good grades and was a cheerleader alongside J.B. As both girls were blossoming into their adulthood, J.B. and Tracy were oblivious to their dreadful fate, which would strip them of all their future hopes and dreams. On July 31, 1999, at around 10:15 p.m., J.B. and Tracy left Dothan in J.B.'s black 1993 Mazda 929 to attend a birthday party organized in J.B.'s honor in Headland, just a few miles north. However, the young girls, being unfamiliar with the roads leading to their destination, soon found themselves in trouble. Within a few minutes of starting their journey from their hometown, they got lost. Around 10:30 p.m., J.B. and Tracy stopped at a BP gas station at the intersection of routes 173 and 431 in Headland in search of directions. Using a payphone at that gas station, they called their friends to get better directions to the party. After the call, the girls kept driving to reach their destination but instead ended up in Ozark, Alabama, about 24 miles northwest of Headland. Realizing they still did not understand the directions to the party, at 11:30 p.m., the girls stopped at the Big Little store. Although the store was already closed by then, Tracy called her mother from the store's payphone. She informed her of how they got lost and ended up in Ozark, and that they were now planning to come back home. At the same time, a woman named Marilyn Merritt and her daughter stopped at the gas station to buy a soda. The girls then asked her for directions back to Dothan. Marilyn tried to explain the way as well as she could, and the young girls seemed to understand. Marilyn would later say that she noticed that the girls looked nice and polite with a clean and tidy car. Marilyn remembered seeing the girls pulling out of the parking lot and turning right just as Marilyn had directed. Although nothing seemed amiss at the time, J.B. Beasley and Tracy Halbach never made it home. The following morning, August 1, 1999, at around 8 a.m., Tracy's mother called the police to report her daughter missing. It did not take police long to find their first clue regarding the girls' whereabouts. Later that day, After Tracy was reported missing, police successfully located JB's car, which had been parked on Herring Avenue in Ozark. The most bizarre thing was, despite having filled the gas tank the day before, the tank was almost empty. The car was muddy, the driver's side window was partially down, yet the doors were locked. However, police could not find any signs of a forced entry into the vehicle. Inside the car, JB's driver's license was lying on the dash. The purses of both girls were still inside the car, along with their cash. The only known missing item was JB's car keys. However, there was no sign of either of the girls. A palm print was recovered from the trunk lid of the locked trunk, which gave the police a foreboding feeling that something was horribly wrong. Assessing the scene, investigators theorized that the locked trunk could provide them with significant clues. But without the keys, they could not open the trunk. It took them 6 long hours to discover that they could open the trunk of the car with the help of an interior latch without needing a trunk key or a locksmith. Upon opening the trunk, police made a grisly discovery. The lifeless bodies of the 2 girls were stuffed inside. Both girls were fully clothed, but their pants were soiled from the waist down. Both girls had been shot once in the head, Tracy in the temple, and JB in the right cheek. Tracy had a 9mm shell casing on her leg, scratches on her arm, and her jeans had thorn briars on them. JB's clothes, on the other hand, were muddy and dirty, especially her newly purchased shoes. Although authorities concluded that the teenagers were killed execution style, they had most likely been killed inside of the trunk. As the families were informed about the heart-wrenching discovery, authorities formally started their homicide investigation. Although investigators were considering robbery as a possible motive during the initial phase of the investigation, it was quickly ruled out after confirming that not only the girls' purses, but also their jewelry, money, and credit cards remained inside the car. Autopsies later confirmed that there were no traces of alcohol or drugs in their system. The report also suggested that the girls had been sexually assaulted prior to their demise. This basically ruled out the possibility of the crime being sexually motivated. However, more than 2 months later, the state crime lab issued a report indicating that there were traces of unknown semen on JB's bra, panties, and skin. The palm print recovered from the lid of the trunk also remained unidentified. With no matches in the system and no one to compare their evidence against, authorities were left without much to go on. As word of a double murder of 2 teen girls spread like wildfire, authorities were no closer to zeroing in on a suspect. A reward was also put out in an attempt to gather information regarding the murder, but it did not uncover any new leads. However, authorities soon got an unexpected breakthrough. On September 1st, exactly 1 month after the bodies of JB and Tracy were found, a longtime Ozark resident, 28-year-old Johnny William Barentine, walked into the Ozark Police Department to tell a bizarre story. He claimed that he had been a witness to the high-profile double homicide of the Dothan teenagers. Barentine told police that on the night of the murders, around the same time Tracy Halbach had called her mother from the payphone at the Big Little store, he went out to buy milk for his 2-year-old son. He claimed that while he was out, he had witnessed the horrendous act. He returned home at 1 a.m., visibly upset, and told his wife that he'd been hit by a black truck near Herring Road. In the days following JB and Tracy's murder, when he shared the information with some of his friends, they convinced him that he should go to the police with this information, as it could be linked to the murders of Tracy and JB, which would not only help police crack the case but could also get him the reward as well. Disturbingly, in the 4-hour interview with Ozark police, Barentine changed his story 6 times. According to then Ozark Police Chief Tony R. Spivey, Barentine initially said that on the night of the killings, he had seen a black truck speeding away from the area where the girls were found. But as the interview continued, his story kept evolving and changing. Finally, he claimed that he'd picked up a tattooed man he didn't know and the two drove by the Big Little store. He further claimed that the man to whom he'd given a ride got into a car with 2 girls, whom Barentine identified as the deceased Dothan teenagers. He said they ended up on Herring Avenue, where the man forced the girls out of the car. A struggle occurred between the man and the girls as they were trying to get away. After placing them in the trunk, Barentine said he saw something in that man's hand moments before hearing 2 gunshots. And when the man returned, Barentine again gave him a ride from the scene and then went home. In another version, Barentine confessed to investigators that he knew the man he'd picked up and given a ride to and identified him to be his neighbor. Alarmingly, Barentine himself lived less than a mile from where police discovered the bodies. Police did not buy his story, naming him the prime suspect in the murder of J.B. Beasley and Tracy Halbach. Ozark police arrested Johnny Barentine on the spot, charging him with 2 counts of capital murder. But there were several problems with his accounts. Barentine never mentioned sexual activity that would account for the semen found on JB's clothing and body. Besides, the neighbor he implicated had an alibi for the evening. Several people noted that he looked startled and like he had just awoken from a deep sleep in his mugshot. Just after arrest, Barentine immediately admitted that he had fabricated the whole story in order to collect the reward money. However, police at the time believed they had arrested the right person. In the preliminary hearing on September 21st, Alabama Bureau of Investigation agent Charles Huddleston testified that Barentine was able to describe the girl's clothing and other items consistent with the crime, suggesting he was there at the scene. From the time of his arrest, Barentine was held without bond in the Dale County Jail in Ozark. In an October 18th bond hearing, Barentine denied he was involved in the killings, confessing to the judge that he never picked up a tattooed man and didn't see anything the night of the murders. He said that he simply went to the BP at about 11 p.m. to get milk for his little boy, and later fabricated the whole story to claim the reward money. However, he was denied bond and sent back to jail. Even during this turbulent time, Barentine's family members never stopped supporting him. They even gave interviews to the media professing his innocence, saying he was incapable of hurting anyone. Barentine's lawyer, Bill Kimmons, also maintained that his client was not responsible for the double murders in any way or form. He further stated that the 4 hours of continued interrogation took a toll on Barentine, who had wrapped himself in this mess of a lie. During police questioning, he was never told that he could go to the bathroom or was free to leave whenever he wanted. Barentine's defense also pointed out the fact that Barentine only finished the 7th grade and a portion of the 8th grade. He said his client was in special education classes, indicating his inability to plan this heinous crime. Barentine was finally released from jail on December 17, 1999, after it was revealed that Barentine's DNA did not match that from the semen found on JB's body and clothing. In January 2000, a Dale County grand jury declined to indict Barentine and cleared him as a suspect in this double murder. After Johnny Barentine was cleared of suspicion, the investigation endured a setback. The methods employed by investigators were also criticized. There began to be mutterings that the Ozark police were incapable of handling the case. However, police still had some potential suspects on their radar. One of the most viable suspects was a man from Michigan who was at a party the night of the murders near where JB's car was later found. Investigators discovered that the man, who was not publicly named, left town within days of the murders. Investigators have even traveled to Michigan 3 times to interview him. He could not account for 3 or 4 hours of his time on the night of the murders, and later made some suspicious statements to people. However, the police declined to elaborate on these alleged statements. As it turned out, he was also later ruled out by DNA. One other significant lead police were chasing during the initial phase of the investigation was the driver of a small white pickup truck. A video surveillance camera inside the Big Little store caught a grainy, poor quality image of what appeared to be a small white pickup truck at the gas pumps at the same time JB and Tracy were at the payphone calling Tracy's mother. No digital trail could be traced though, as there was no record of a gas purchase at the pump at that time. The video neither showed anyone getting out of the truck, nor did it show the driver clearly. After releasing a photo of the truck to the media a month into the investigation, police urged the public to come forward with information. Unfortunately, both the driver and the truck vanished into thin air as the lead faded away. The last lead for the investigators was a man from Mississippi. Police said the man, who was extradited from Jones County, had been arrested there on an outstanding warrant for possession of drug paraphernalia issued in Ozark. The man had been staying with relatives in Ozark, but left 2 days after the murders. According to Spivey, investigators wanted to question him in connection with the case. However, no significant information came out in light of this lead. Without any evidence, investigators were forced to let him go. In March of 2000, a woman called police and said she heard screams and 2 gunshots near Highway 123 South, just inside the city limits on the night of July 31st, 1999. When asked why she did not come forward earlier, she claimed she was scared to get involved. Based on her description, police thoroughly searched the area and discovered a 9mm bullet, the same type used to kill the girls. But the brand name of the bullet did not match the brand of bullet shell casing found on Tracy's body. Furthermore, the unspent bullet had no markings that would help with forensic comparison to other evidence in the case. Again, another dead end for investigators. Although several leads over the years proved to lead nowhere, investigators never lost hope in the search for a DNA match. As the heartbroken families of JB and Tracy tried to get on with their lives, the case turned cold. Then years later, another twist in the case added another layer to the thrilling mystery. After remaining cold for years, 2015 would mark a bombshell allegation in the murder case of JB Beasley and Tracy Halbach. Rena Crum, a sworn Ozark Auxiliary police officer, came forward and openly accused an Ozark police officer of murdering JB Beasley and Tracy Halbach and others of covering it up. Rena alleged that on the night of July 31st, 1999, a police officer for Ozark Police pulled over JB Beasley, demanding to know the whereabouts of some cassette tapes that contained recorded conversations. According to Rena, these tapes could have incriminated Ozark police officers regarding the illegal business of cocaine distribution and profits. The incident escalated into the murders of 2 innocent teens, she further alleged. Rena claimed that she'd been threatened by multiple law enforcement officials who had knowledge of the murderer's identity and covered it up by getting rid of evidence. Rena named 3 cops, Gary Butch Whittington, Rex Tipton, and Eddie Henderson, accusing them of harassing and threatening her. She went as far as to say that then Police Chief Tony Spivey, who headed the original investigation, had also helped cover it up. However, she shied away from revealing the name of the police officer who she claimed had actually committed the murders. Renowned American journalist and newspaper editor John B. Carroll wrote an article saying that he believed the officer in question presumed the 2 girls intended to use these tapes in a court case that was scheduled for August 2, 1999, less than 48 hours after they were murdered. The tapes were to be entered as evidence into that case. In this article, Carroll also stated that Rena was severely beaten with a baseball bat after coming forward, which stopped her from naming the actual killer. The law enforcement officials Rena accused had all denied having any involvement in the murders of JB Beasley and Tracy Halbach. Without any physical evidence, none of them were ever formally named as a suspect in the case. Regardless of that, the allegations blew up on numerous true crime websites and social media, leading to a defamation lawsuit. On January 29, 2016, Keith Coffin, Rex Tipton, Tony Spivey, Eddie Henderson, and Gary Butch Whittington, all Ozark, Alabama, police officials, filed a lawsuit against Rena Crum, John B. Carroll, and Dean Matthews for libel, slander, and defamation of character. That case was dismissed in 2018. In May 2016, Rena Crum received a suspended sentence and a $250 fine after being convicted for harassing JB Beasley's sister. Over the years, authorities investigated many theories. They interviewed hundreds of people and took DNA samples from several suspects, but to no avail. It would take 20 years and the innovation of new DNA technologies before police could ever hand a suspect. In March 2019, investigators sent the DNA found on JB's body and clothes to the Virginia-based Parabon Nanolabs, which specializes in DNA phenotyping and genomics using public genealogy databases. After analyzing the DNA, the lab finally made a connection to a suspect, Coley McCraney. 45-year-old Coley Lewis McCraney was never on the radar of investigators in the brutal 1999 murders of JB Beasley and Tracy Halbach until DNA implicated him in the crime. McCraney, who was an Alabama native, graduated from Carroll High School in Ozark in 1992, where he was an athlete as well as the president of the library club. After that, he joined the U.S. Air Force and served there from 1993 to 1997. He was married in 1992 but separated from his first wife in 1994 and later divorced. According to the reports of Dothan Eagle at the time, McCraney's ex-wife filed a complaint with the Air Force in 1994, stating that McCraney had assaulted her. McCraney remarried in 2001 and had children with his second wife. Other than failing to pay child support in 1998, McCraney had no criminal record in the past 20 years or so. He'd been working as a trucker all of his life and had worked for several trucking companies in Alabama over the years. In recent years, he co-founded a church and worked as a bishop there. At the time of the killings, he was around 26 and living on Lisenby Drive in Ozark, about 1 mile away from where the bodies of J.B. Beasley and Tracy Halbach were found in 1999. 2 decades after the Northview High School seniors J.B. Beasley and Tracy Halbach were found, Coley McCraney was arrested after a traffic stop in Daleville, Alabama on March 19, 2019. In the interview with police after he was taken into custody, McCraney said he did not know the girls. Investigators did not clarify any motive for the murder. The news of his arrest was a great shock to the Ozark community and the Ozark Police Chief, Marlos Walker, who went to school with McCraney, as it seemed that the many twisted strands in this Athens-like case were finally all being tied together. There was to be one more revelation. The now 53-year-old Rena Crum, who previously accused the Ozark Police Department of covering up the murder, recanted her allegations as she testified during a hearing for McCraney in August 2022. McCraney, now 49, is facing 2 counts of capital murder charges for the shooting deaths of J.B. Beasley and Tracy Halbach. He now sits behind bars in Dale County Jail as of the time of this writing. His bond has been denied, pending his trial. The news of finally apprehending the killer was a relief to the families of both girls. However, reliving all the haunting memories through the trial and hearings is another painful journey still to come. We can only hope that the families can heal through a sense of peace that their daughters are finally getting justice more than 2 decades later. Do you believe McCraney is responsible for the murders? So, what was the motive? Do you find any validity in the police cover-up claims? Tanya Van Cuylenborg was born on March 7, 1969 in Victoria, Canada. She had loving parents and an older brother she was very close to. From a young age, Tanya loved animals and even considered becoming a veterinarian someday. She also wanted to travel and explore the world. In high school, she went to Paris with her best friend, and that trip made her dream of traveling even stronger. Shortly before graduating high school, when she was 18, Tanya met a boy named Jay Cook. They went to the same school, but Jay was 2 years older. They met through a mutual friend after he had graduated, and soon they began dating. Even though Tanya wanted to be a veterinarian, she decided to take some time before going to college so she could travel. After finishing high school, she got a job at a cafe to save money for these plans, and she also worked as a dog walker. Jay also didn't go to college after high school. Instead, he helped his father with their small family business installing heating systems. In November 1987, Jay's father received an order, but the local suppliers didn't have one of the key parts in stock. The nearest place to buy it was Seattle in Washington state. Jay's father decided it would be quicker and cheaper to get the part himself rather than order it for delivery. However, he was swamped with work and knew he couldn't fit the trip into his schedule. So he asked his son to go to Seattle instead of him, and Jay agreed. Jay wanted to help his father with the business, but he was also excited for another reason. He decided to invite Tanya, knowing she would likely enjoy the trip. At that time, they had been dating for about 6 months, but their relationship wasn't very serious. Jay hoped that the trip would change that and bring them closer. As he expected, Tanya agreed right away. They planned to leave Victoria in the morning, reach Seattle by evening, and returned the next day. Jay's father gave him his van and money to book a hotel room for the night. However, Jay and Tanya decided to save that money and just sleep in the van. Jay's father also gave him a check for $700 to buy the part and a few $100s for other expenses. Despite Seattle being relatively close to Victoria, the couple had to take 2 ferries, first to get into the US and then to cross the bay near Seattle. On the morning of November 18th, the couple got into the van and headed to the first ferry, which would take them to Port Angeles. Their parents expected them to return home the next day in the afternoon, but Tanya and Jay never showed up. Their families began to worry almost immediately, knowing the ferry schedule and realizing that if the couple had taken the ferry, they should have been home by now. However, the parents considered the possibility that Tanya and Jay might have simply decided to explore and enjoy the beautiful sights along the way, causing them to miss the ferry in Port Angeles. As time passed and there was still no sign of them, Tanya's parents called Jay's parents. By the afternoon, they were seriously concerned that something bad had happened. Despite their worries, the family held on to hope that the couple had just decided to extend their trip and continued to wait. Jay and Tanya did not return home by the end of the day, and the next morning their parents went to the police station to file a missing persons report. However, the local police decided there wasn't enough reason to conduct a full search. Tanya was 18 and Jay was 20. There was no direct evidence that they had been harmed or were victims of a crime, so the police assumed the couple had just gone off on an adventure and told their parents to wait a few days. Naturally, they weren't satisfied with this response. The officers refused to start the search. By that time, Tanya and Jay's parents were completely certain that they wouldn't have just decided to extend their trip for several days. Jay was supposed to do an important job for his father's business, and he had never been so irresponsible before, and if they had indeed decided to extend their trip, they would have at least called their families from a payphone which were plentiful along their route. Eventually, Tanya's father decided to start the search on his own. First, he and Jay's parents found out that their children never picked up the part in Seattle. The supplier said he had waited for them for several hours, but no one showed up. Next, Tanya's father drove along the route to Seattle, but this didn't yield any results. He found no trace of Tanya, Jay, or their van. Undeterred, he contacted a private company and rented a helicopter with a pilot to survey the area along their route from the air. However, this also led to nothing. Most of the area was covered with dense forests, making it difficult to spot anything. After that, Tanya's father made flyers with information about their disappearance and went to Seattle to post them on the streets. This went on for several days. The families of the missing couple did everything they could to find them, and the local police department finally started taking the case seriously. However, they still believed that Tanya and Jay were just spending time together somewhere and would eventually come home. As a result, they only contacted their colleagues in Seattle, providing a description of the van and information about Tanya and Jay, asking to notify them if anyone spotted them. On November 24th, 5 days after the disappearance, a man went for a walk in the woods near a small town about 90 miles north of Seattle. While walking along the road near an embankment leading into the forest, he noticed something unusual under a tree below. When he took a closer look, he realized it was a human body and immediately called the police. Officers arrived at the scene and discovered the body of a young woman. Her clothes were partially missing, hands were tied, and there was a gunshot wound on her head. Investigators quickly determined that the victim had been killed elsewhere, as there was almost no blood near the body. There was no ID on the victim, so the police checked the list of missing women in the area. They quickly concluded that the victim matched the description of Tanya von Kylenborg and contacted her father. He went to the morgue and confirmed that the deceased was indeed his daughter. Detectives began their investigation, trying to establish all the details of what had happened. They learned that Tanya had been traveling with Jay, whose whereabouts were still unknown. Jay's van was also missing, leading investigators to consider his possible involvement. Jay's family refused to believe he could have done something like this. They insisted that he had never shown signs of aggression and that he loved Tanya. He also did not own a firearm and would not have been able to purchase one easily. While the police were trying to locate him, they got another call. A bartender from a town called Bellingham, about 18 miles from where the body was found, went outside and saw a wallet and keys on the ground. When he opened the wallet, he found an ID with the name Tanya van Kylenborg. At first, he didn't call the police. Instead, he took everything back to the bar, thinking the owner might return for them. But after seeing a news report about Tanya's murder on TV, he immediately called 911. Detectives searched the area around the bar and found several plastic zip ties, identical to those used to bind Tanya's hands under the back porch. They also discovered rubber gloves and a half-empty box of bullets. But that wasn't all. One of the officers noticed a van parked nearby, and the police quickly determined that it was the same vehicle Tanya and Jay had traveled in. Inside the van, there was utter chaos. Everything was scattered and broken, but investigators managed to find several important clues. There were numerous receipts that could help reconstruct Tanya and Jay's route, as well as a ferry ticket. This indicated that the couple had indeed made it to Seattle, and something horrible happened to them there. Detectives also noticed that Tanya's camera, which she had taken on the trip, was missing from the van. Since it wasn't found near her body either, they speculated that the killer might have taken it. The interior of the van was covered in blood. Forensic experts collected these samples and sent them to the lab, hoping that this evidence would bring them closer to solving the case. At that time, DNA analysis was just starting to be used in criminology, but it had already helped solve several cases. The lab in Seattle conducted the analysis and found 3 blood samples: Tanya's, Jay's, and an unknown man's. Since the FBI's DNA database did not exist yet, it was impossible to identify the third person without a direct comparison. Nevertheless, detectives realized that Jay was likely not involved in the murder and stopped considering him as the main suspect. They now faced other questions. Was he still alive, and where was he? Unfortunately, it didn't take long to find the answer. On November 26th, a group of friends went hunting just a few dozen miles from Seattle. While walking near a bridge over a small river, they saw a human body in the bushes and reported it to the police. Investigators quickly identified the deceased as Jay Cook. His body showed numerous bruises, and the cause of death appeared to be strangulation. Given the brutality of this crime, detectives even considered that the perpetrator might have known Jay and had some personal motives. They also theorized that Jay had been killed first since his body was found closer to Seattle. The perpetrator then drove Tanya in the van almost to the Canadian border, killed her, and left her body in a wooded area. Medical experts also found traces of semen on her body, and DNA analysis revealed that it belonged to the same man whose blood was found in the van. However, his identity remained unknown. At the same time, investigators were trying to reconstruct the couple's route, and the receipts found in the van helped them establish an approximate timeline. After Tanya and Jay took the ferry from Victoria to Port Angeles, they stopped at a store to buy some food. Then they headed towards Seattle, but Jay apparently missed the turn for the shortest route. This was supported by a receipt from a store in the small town of Hoodsport and the testimony of the store clerk, who saw a young couple matching their description and remembered they asked for directions to the ferry crossing. The clerk also shared an interesting observation. She thought that a man in a brown raincoat was following the couple. He entered the store shortly after them and left right after they did, but she didn't see where the man went next. The next receipt showed detectives that Tanya and Jay had visited a store in the small town of Allen. After that, they reached the ferry near Seattle and bought a ticket. Several witnesses saw them near this location, but detectives couldn't track their movements beyond that point. Investigators began checking various individuals in Seattle who had previous convictions for violent crimes, trying to find suspects, but these efforts yielded no results. Despite having the killer's DNA, the police had no idea how to identify the perpetrator. They suspected this person had committed serious crimes before, as it was hard to believe an amateur could pull off such an elaborate crime. It seemed likely he had followed the couple for a while and managed to abduct them once they reached Seattle. Investigators thought he might have gained their trust by asking for a ride and at some point used a gun to force them to comply with his demands. They also thought that the killer had deliberately left Tanya's belongings and the rubber gloves in a visible place to taunt the police. Perhaps the killer was trying to say that it was useless to search for his fingerprints since he wore gloves and they wouldn't be able to catch him. It's worth mentioning that forensic experts found several fingerprints on the van that did not belong to Tony or Jay. However, the police doubted they belonged to the killer, given that he likely wore gloves. These prints were not in any databases, so they did not bring investigators any closer to catching the perpetrator. For the next few weeks, detectives continued to search for new leads or witnesses and checked various suspects, but none of these efforts yielded results. This continued until December, about a month after the murders, when something unexpected happened. Tanya and Jay's family started receiving letters and postcards from someone claiming to be the killer. In these messages, the sender confessed to the crimes, mocked the victims' families, and said the police would never catch him. Investigators tried to trace the sender, but this was extremely difficult in those days. All they could determine was which cities the letters were sent from. But this information did not help identify the perpetrator. The letters continued to arrive on a regular basis, often during holidays, which investigators believed was the sender's way of causing the families even more pain. Police also found that the letters were sent from different cities and states, indicating that the sender traveled around the country. However, they weren't entirely sure that the sender was the killer. In high-profile cases, it's not uncommon for people to torment the victims' families with fake letters claiming to be from the perpetrator. Unfortunately, fake letters from supposed perpetrators are a common thing. Since then, there was no significant progress in the case for many years. Detectives continued to investigate potential suspects and did not rule out the involvement of a serial killer. This theory was supported by the fact that two other couples had been abducted in the same part of the state in recent years, although the police found the connection between these cases tenuous. The following years, investigators caught several serial killers operating in the area, but none were linked to the murders of Tanya and Jay. In 2003, the case was reopened and detectives entered the perpetrator's DNA sample into the FBI database, but no matches were found. Despite this, they continued to believe that the perpetrator must have had a lengthy criminal history, but either had not been caught by the police or had been arrested before DNA sampling became mandatory. In 2010, something else happened. This case was featured on a popular national TV program, resulting in numerous fresh tips. One caller suggested that he might know the identity of the person who sent the letters to the victims' families. This lead pointed to a 78-year-old man from Seattle, and the police began investigating him. It turned out that this man had traveled extensively around the country during those years, and the location of his trips matched the cities from which the letters were sent. Detectives concluded that he was indeed the author of these letters, but had no connection to the actual murders. This individual clearly suffered from severe mental health issues, and his DNA did not match the blood and semen samples from the crime scenes. This confirmed that the letters were written not by the real perpetrator, but by a completely unrelated person. The case remained cold for several more years. In 2018, detectives learned about Parabon, a company offering to create composite sketches of individuals based on their DNA samples. Given the lack of any other leads, investigators decided to try this method. Parabon experts created estimated sketches of the killer at different ages, and the police distributed these images to the media, hoping someone might recognize the man. However, it led nowhere. Despite this, the investigators refused to give up and decided to try another method, genetic genealogy. Parabon experts uploaded the killer's DNA sample to public databases and began searching for any distant relatives of the perpetrator. They identified a possible second cousin of the killer and started tracing her family tree. They were searching for a man who lived in Seattle or its vicinity in 1987 and matched all the criteria, including age. With the help of his cousin, they eventually identified their suspect, a 55-year-old man named William Talbot. He lived in a Seattle suburb and worked as a truck driver. Before they could arrest him, police needed to confirm that the killer's DNA matched his. They surveilled William for a couple of days and eventually retrieved a coffee cup he had discarded. The saliva sample from the cup provided a DNA profile that was a perfect match. In mid-May 2018, 30 years after the murders, investigators finally arrested William. He denied any involvement and the case went to court. The trial began in 2019 and the defense attorneys tried to challenge the primary evidence, the DNA. They argued that the semen on Tanya's body could have resulted from consensual intercourse. They also pointed out that the prosecution had no other evidence directly linking William to Jay's murder. However, the prosecutor had a strong counterargument. As we remember, back in 1987, experts found fingerprints on the fan that did not match Tanya or Jay, nor did they match anyone in the database at the time. Now, experts compared these fingerprints to William's, and they were a match. Another crucial piece of evidence came from William's friend. He testified that he saw a brown van outside William's house in 1987, which clearly didn't belong to him. This suggested that William might have driven the van to his house, although it was unclear whether this was before or after the murders. William also lived only a few miles from where Jay's body was found, indicating he was familiar with the area. None of William's relatives attended the trial, but they did share quite a bit with the investigators. They described William as always being very aggressive, and other family members were genuinely afraid of him. Because of this, most had cut off contact with him after he had moved out. When they learned about the charges against him, none were surprised that William could have committed such crimes. The prosecution's theory was that William had asked Tanya and Jay for a ride to Seattle under some pretext. Once they arrived in the city at night, he used a gun to force them to drive to a remote area. He then killed them at different locations, discarded Tanya's belongings and the van in another town, and remained off the police radar for the next 30 years. Without a confession, it was impossible to establish more details, but with such substantial evidence, no one doubted William's guilt. The trial ended in June 2019, and William was found guilty of the double murder. He received 2 life sentences without the possibility of parole. Notably, this was the first case where genetic genealogy led to a conviction. However, an unexpected problem arose after the trial. William's lawyers appealed the conviction, arguing that the jury had been biased against the defendant, which they claimed violated his constitutional rights and made the jurors unfit to serve. This led to a judge overturning the conviction in 2021, granting William the right to a retrial. However, in 2022, a higher court reversed this decision, upholding the original conviction. As for William's potential involvement in other crimes, there is still no clarity. He had previous convictions for minor and medium offenses, but had never been charged with murder. Investigators still believe William may be linked to other unsolved cases because the murder of Tanya and Jay did not seem like the work of an amateur. The way he executed the crime and evaded justice for decades indicated he might have killed before, but we may never learn the truth. For the Halbach family, a reminder that nightmares can filter into reality. For Teresa Halbach, October 31, 2005 was another day at the office. As a freelance photographer working for Auto Trader magazine at the time, she received a call to shoot a few photos at the Abray's Auto Salvage. She was never seen again. First reported as a missing person on November 3, 2005, a large-scale search began for Teresa. On the afternoon of November 5, 2005, her Toyota RAV4 SUV was found partially concealed in Avery's salvage yard. Investigators later discovered blood in the vehicle. Charred bone fragments and teeth were also found in a burn pit on the same property. Her car keys were in the room of the property owner, Stephen Avery. Born on March 22, 1980, Teresa was one of 5 siblings. Her parents, Richard and Karen, raised her on the family dairy farm. When she was 8 years old, her father sadly passed away. Karen eventually remarried Richard's brother Thomas, and together they raised their blended family. Teresa was an outdoorsy girl who aspired to work for National Geographic as a photojournalist. Friends described her as having an uncanny ability to make everyone feel welcomed. She was dedicated to her studies, making summa cum laude with a degree in photography. After graduating from the University of Wisconsin-Green Bay, Teresa continued to work with Pierce Photography, whom she interned with during her college days. She started her own business, Photography by Teresa, and operated out of the Pierce studio. She traveled extensively, and to supplement her income, she took on freelance jobs for Auto Trader magazine, taking pictures of vehicles that were put up for sale. It was this job that led to her untimely death. All the evidence found pointed to one person, Stephen Avery. Avery had contacted Teresa to set up an appointment to take pictures of his sister's minivan. According to records, she was last seen at 2:30 p.m. that afternoon. This was later confirmed by Stephen's nephew, Bobby, who told police he saw the car enter the salvage yard. Avery was initially charged with a weapons violation as a convicted felon. On November 11, 2005, he was formally charged with the murder of Teresa, kidnapping, sexual assault, and mutilation of a corpse. The blood found in the SUV proved a positive match for Avery's. A set of car keys belonging to Teresa found in Avery's room. All the while, Avery maintained his innocence, alleging the police were trying to frame him. He was in the middle of a civil lawsuit with Manitowoc County for $36 million. Stephen Avery, born July 9, 1962, is a Manitowoc County native raised in Wisconsin alongside his two brothers, Charles and Earl, and sister Barbara by parents Dolores and Alan. He dropped out of high school with reports suggesting he had an IQ of 70. Stephen was no stranger to the law. In 1981, he served 10 months in jail following the burglary of a bar. A year later, he pleaded guilty to animal cruelty after pouring gasoline on this pet cat and tossing it into a bonfire. For this, he served another 9 months. In 1985, he threatened his cousin Sharon Morris by forcing her off the road and thereafter pointing a gun at her. He later alleged that he wanted her to stop spreading rumors. She'd filed a report alleging that he exposed himself on several occasions and was meeting in the front yard. Although he received a 6-year sentence for his crime, he was granted bail and released. However, it was a case of mistaken identity that hadn't locked away for nearly 2 decades. Penny Bjernston reported that she'd been walking along a beach near Two Rivers when she was attacked and assaulted on July 29, 1985. Police believe the description she gave had a striking resemblance to Avery. She went on to choose his photo during an interview with police and later picked him out during a suspect lineup. He was arrested and charged with the attack on Bjernston. A state-appointed forensic official claimed that a hair found on Avery's shirt was consistent with the victim's. This evidence led to his conviction in December 1985. All this despite a staggering 16 witness testimonies and a time-stamped receipt to prove his whereabouts at the time of the assault. Stephen was convicted of rape and attempted murder and sentenced to 32 years in prison. Avery maintained his innocence and appealed in both 1987 and 1996. Both appeals were denied by the higher court. In 2001, though, Stephen made contact with the Wisconsin Innocence Project. The organization took on the case, and in 2002, Stephen was exonerated after DNA evidence proved he was innocent. It was later learned that another man, Gregory Allen, committed the crime and did, in fact, confess to it in 1995. Deputies allege that Sheriff Deputy Thomas Kokorek received a call and said, "We already have the right guy. Don't concern yourself with it." Allen and Steve bore a striking resemblance. Allen also committed a similar crime in the same area that Bjernston was attacked and was under police surveillance, but he was not considered a suspect. Allen was not even called up as a suspect in the Liam. After 18 years, Stephen walked out a free man on September 11, 2003. He then went to file a civil lawsuit against former Sheriff Thomas Kokorek and former District Attorney Dennis Vogel to the tune of $36 million. His freedom wouldn't last long. When Teresa was reported missing, searches were conducted in the salvage yard. This was the place she had last been seen, as confirmed by Stephen's nephew, Bobby Gassie. Stephen claimed that he'd spoken to Teresa when she came by to take the photos, and then she left. Apart from the bone fragments, SUV, car keys, and blood found in the car, a bullet with Teresa's DNA was discovered in the garage. While incarcerated for Teresa's murder, Stephen's lawsuit was settled in February 2006, and he was paid a mere $400,000. While in jail, Stephen's younger nephew, Brendan Dassey, was also questioned in relation to the murder. Brendan, who was 16 years old at the time of the murder, was interrogated by police without parental supervision or a lawyer being present. Brendan confessed to investigators that he and Stephen first assaulted Teresa before murdering her. They then burned her body to destroy evidence. "I go down to put it up aside, tear it up, pull it, cut it where. I did it." He was charged in March 2006 as an accessory to the murder. He later recanted his statement, claiming that he'd been coerced by detectives. Brendan was charged with the same crimes as Stephen, although there was no physical evidence linking him to the crime scene. Stephen was convicted in March 2007 and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Later that same year, Brendan too was found guilty and given a life sentence with the possibility of parole in 2048. But there was not to be a cut and dry solution to the murder. The conviction sparked controversy. It was a sensational case. Stephen was the first of the Innocent Project's 174 exonerated convicts to be charged with a violent crime after being released. This caught the interest of aspiring filmmakers Laura Ricciardi and Moira Dimos. Making a Murderer premiered on Netflix in 2015 and created a media maelstrom. The documentary, which took 10 years to research and produce, profiled the case of Steven Avery. The series chronicles the case timeline beginning with Steven's wrongful conviction in 1985 and subsequent exoneration, civil lawsuit against the men at Toa County, and the arrest of Steven and Brendan in regard to the murder of Teresa Halbach. It received both praise and criticism from critics and those directly involved with Teresa's case. The story caused on an international level has driven to division and public opinion. A petition to have Steven and Brendan pardoned was drawn up and sent to the White House. It garnered over 128,000 signatures, but still failed to make any impact. The White House stated, as the convictions were made in a state court, the president had no authority to pardon either defendant. There are those who firmly support the innocence of Steven and Brendan. These include his immediate family, who have supported him and also pray for the real killer of Teresa to be found. Sandy Greenman, Steven's ex-fiancée, is one such person. Greenman has been his avid supporter, going as far as to start a Facebook page to garner support and give exposure to the case. She described him as a model inmate. Greenman stated that people take a perverse pleasure in tainting Steven's name. People like to say Steven Avery has been violent all his life, which is not true, she said. Most notably, though, was the support offered by Kim Kardashian. The socialite has been using her influence to advocate for a fair justice system. Having come across the case on a social media site, her interest was piqued. Although she's made appeals to the governor, even her level of influence has no sway. However, she hasn't given up and hopes to seek justice for both Steven and Brendan. The other half feels Steven is where he belongs. On that side of the coin is Jody Stachowski, another ex-fiancée. Jody initially pledged her support in Steven's innocence during the documentary. Afterwards, she alleged that she had lied and it was all an act. Jody went on to explain to Nancy Grayson in an interview that he threatened to kill her and her family. He alleged that he wanted revenge on all women after his life was wrongfully stolen from him. Steven is the one person I can't trust. He's a monster, she said. The show also ignited a debate regarding the perspective covered by the documentary. For the supporters of Steven and Brendan, they feel the points most significant to the trial were highlighted. Dean Strang, one of Steven's attorneys, agreed that the documentary covered enough to give the public a chance to judge for themselves. He disagreed that the series was subjective. As for the relatives of Teresa, they say the show saddened them. The Halbachs stated the show sought to entertain and seek profit from their loss. Teresa's aunt, Kay Giordana, and cousin-in-law, Jeremy Fournier, both stated that the show was one-sided. Former Calumet County District Attorney Ken Krantz alleges he was not given a chance to tell his side of the story. The filmmakers denied this and claim that he refused to give an interview. In an interview with People magazine, Krantz alleges the documentary has left out key pieces of evidence. These include Steven using a fake name when calling Teresa. DNA belonging to Steven was found on the SUV's hood latch, and a ballistics report showed that the bullet found in the garage was fired from a rifle owned by Steven. Krantz further alleges that prior to her murder, Teresa had once before made a trip to the Avery residence. When Steven answered the door with only a towel on, she said she wouldn't go back because she was scared of him. In response to criticism from Krantz and other officials, the filmmakers said they'd given prosecutors the opportunity to answer questions. They believed that the documentary was a fair representation of the case and covered the most consequential evidence given during the trial. The documentary had its desired effect. It poked holes into the narrative of Steven Brendan's case by exposing allegations of police and prosecutorial misconduct, evidence tampering, and witness coercion. At the outset, Steven called out the police for trying to frame him. This to avoid the county paying out the $36 million lawsuit he filed. Steven believed his lawsuit would be undermined if he was convicted of another violent crime. To avoid a conflict of interest, Manitowoc County gave neighboring Calumet County authority over the handling of the case. Part of the deal, however, was that Calumet could use resources which included personnel from Manitowoc. The key in Stephen's room was found by a Manitowoc sheriff's deputy after several searches of the property. Another allegation made was regarding the blood evidence found in the car. Stephen and his defense team believe it was blood used from his prior conviction. Given credence to this scenario were the claims made by the defense. According to the Avery defense team, the vial containing Stephen's blood had been tapered with and a puncture hole was visible on the stopper. The prosecution combated this claim by testing the blood for a preservative not found in fresh human blood and found none. Avery's defense team brought in an expert witness who stated it was not possible to tell if the negative result meant there was none of the preservative present or the topology to test itself was inconclusive. The documentary shone a spotlight on the men who have interrogation with regard to Brendan Dassey. Dassey was just 16 years old during the interrogation. Firstly, he was interviewed without the supervision of a lawyer or parent. It's understood that both he and his mother consented to the interrogation. But what piqued the interest of many was that Brendan had an IQ of 73, classifying him as intellectually challenged. Many have argued that his intellectual disability left him open to suggestion, particularly when it was shown that the re-technique of interrogation was used. The re-technique has been criticized for producing hybrids of false confessions, especially from juveniles and the mentally impaired. The technique is used to make the suspect comfortable and eventually confess to crimes through familiarity with the interrogators. The interrogator then proceeds to tell the suspect that the evidence shows that the suspect did commit the crime. Dassey allegedly agrees with the interrogators during the interviews, but later we can't at his confession. He accused his first defense team of collaborating with the prosecution to get him to confess. He's also claimed the coercion was used to elicit a confession from them. Both Stephen and Brendan have appealed their convictions, but have been denied innumerable times and remain in prison. The defense teams of both men have exhausted their efforts in trying to get retrials on both men's charges. Following the making a murder documentary and the public outcry regarding Stephen and Brendan's innocence, significant new developments have occurred in both their legal teams. Professors Lauren I. Ryder and Stephen Dryson of the Northwestern University Center on Wrongful Convictions of Youth are representing Brendan. They too began with numerous appeals and have come up against many hurdles, but have refused to give up just yet. Meanwhile, Stephen's appointment of Kathleen Zellner has shaken up the case and given further hits to the prosecution's claims. His previous lawyers, Deems Trang and Jerry Buting, have taken their newfound fame and gone on tour to promote and bring attention to the case of Stephen Avery. Zellner, considered a trailblazing trial lawyer, has been responsible for overturning 19 wrongful convictions. Her dogged determination and careful analysis of cases has seen her uncover missing evidence that helped exonerate her clients. Most recently notable, she was a consultant for Johnny Depp and his defense team during his trial. Zellner hit the ground running once she was appointed to Stephen's defense team and firmly believes her client is innocent. One of the first things she put to rest was the alleged confession of Joseph Evans Jr. Evans alleged he was responsible for killing Teresa and trying to frame Stephen. Zellner stated that it was a not-so-subtle attempt at publicity. Previously, Evans played snitch and allegedly wrote a 9-page letter to media outlets, claiming he heard Stephen confess to the murder. This time, though, it seems he wanted in on a portion of reward money to make his life in prison more comfortable. However, his claim is not gaining the traction he expected. In August 2016, Zellner filed a motion demanding new scientific testing be done. Willing to pay for the extensive testing, Zellner intended to use this evidence to prove that Stephen had been framed. The theory was that 3 different burn pits showed evidence of human remains being burned. A particularly significant find was thought of a human pelvic bone fragment, a bone that was given to the Halbachs as part of Teresa's remains. This action, claims Zellner, was proof that Teresa's remains were planted in Stephen's burrowing pit. The defense, however, didn't get the opportunity to test these bones as they were not disclosed to them. This was a Brady violation according to Zellner, meaning that evidence which could have helped exonerate Stephen was not disclosed in the proper manner with regards to the criminal case. Crucial evidence was just out of their reach. Zellner remained relentless in her pursuit for justice. She approached the case with a new angle, one that could potentially point to a new suspect in the case. Being unable to test the bone fragments, Zellner opted for forensic testing of the Dassey family computer. What she found on it was damning. Pornographic images of women in various stages of torture, violent images and videos depicting women as victims. All these images were allegedly accessed at times when Bobby Dassey was at home. Furthermore, Zellner pointed out that Barbara, Bobby, and Brendan's mother, along with Stephen's sister and her husband, Stott Toddick, were trying to get rid of evidence that could implicate Bobby. The forensic team were able to download 2,449 pages of data from the computer to a CD-ROM to present as part of the motion for a retrial. On it were all the searches, videos, and photos accessed by Bobby. Bobby is the older brother of Brendan and the nephew of Stephen. He was also the key eyewitness for the prosecution at Stephen's trial. He alleged that he last saw Teresa going to his uncle's house, and when he returned from hunting that afternoon, did not see her or the car again. Added to these claims are the allegations of his half-brother, Brad Dassey. Brad is alleged to have said he believes his uncle is innocent. He also made claims that his stepmother, Barb, and Stephen's brother-in-law, Scott, wiped the computer, deleting all pornographic material. Allegedly, Barb has filed a harassment suit against Brad, following a conversation they had about tracing deleted files from a computer, which some believe is, in part, to ensure Brad remains silent about his knowledge. For Bobby, though, the final nail in this coffin could be the evidence that exonerates Stephen and, in turn, Brendan. An eyewitness has come forward claiming to have seen Bobby being assisted by a much older man pushing Teresa's SUV back into the salvage yard. Thomas Sawinski stated in a sworn affidavit that he drove by Bobby and the other man while en route to deliver newspapers. When he passed the duo a second time, Bobby allegedly stepped out in front of his car to stop him. Thomas swerved to avoid him and continued on his morning route. He said that Bobby's eyes showed he was not pleased to see him there. Following the discovery of the SUV, Thomas realized the significance of the find and contacted police. He told them everything he'd seen that morning, and their response was, "We already know who did it." He provided his details, but he'd never heard back from them. For Zellner, this provides a contradiction to the prosecution's key witness. If proven true, which he's confident about, Bobby's testimony would be false. Zellner believes the rejection of all the crucial evidence in favor of Stephen denied him a fair chance to prove his innocence years ago. The newly filed motion is still with the appeals court and is awaiting an opinion or decision to be read over in November 2022. Stephen Avery continues to maintain his innocence. Kathleen Zellner, in her own words, says she represents the wrongfully convicted and added, "If you lie to her, she will find you out." Could Stephen be the scapegoat to a bigger conspiracy? Is this all a conspiracy to discredit Stephen's claim of improper police procedure? Or was there a monster truly hiding within Stephen all these years? Please let us know your thoughts in the comments section below. Robin Cornell was born on November 30th, 1978 in Florida. She had an older sister and a loving mother, Jan, who raised the girls on her own since their father was not actively involved in their lives. When Robin was 10, they moved to a town called Cape Coral. Jan got a job at a local hospital and found a home just a few minutes' walk from work. Her older daughter had gone off to study and moved out, so it was just Jan and her younger daughter living together. Robin really liked this town. She made friends right away at her new school, joined a few sports teams, and quickly settled into her new environment. In her free time, Robin loved exploring nature with her friends, but most of all, she loved animals. Once, she found an injured bird, took it home, and nursed it back to health until it could fly again. Jan was also happy with the move. She had found a good job and met a man named Donald, and they started dating. Since the birth of her daughters, had devoted all her time to caring for them and working, so she was glad to finally have a chance to build her own personal life. At the hospital, Jan also met a woman named Lisa, and over time, they became best friends. In early May 1990, Jan suggested Lisa move in with them as it was difficult for Lisa to afford renting a place on her own. Jan was also happy to share the rent, and they had plenty of space. Their complex consisted of 2-story townhouses, and there was a spare room for Lisa. Eventually, Lisa moved in. She immediately got along with Robin, who was 11 at the time, and even agreed to babysit her when Jan was at work. On the evening of May 9th, a week after Lisa moved in with him, Jan planned to visit Donald to watch a game together. At first, she thought about canceling these plans because she felt uneasy asking Lisa to watch Robin for the entire evening. But Lisa reassured her that it was no trouble at all and she would be happy to spend time with her. So, Jan went to Donald's house, leaving Robin with Lisa. She planned to return in a few hours as she had to work an early shift at the hospital the next morning. However, she accidentally fell asleep while watching TV. Jan woke up around 3 a.m., got ready, and drove back home. When she approached her front door, she was surprised to find it locked on both locks. This was strange because she had told Lisa that she only had the key to the top lock. As she tried to unlock the door, heard footsteps inside and thought her friend was coming to let her in. But the footsteps quickly faded, so she knocked on the door several times. When no one answered, Jan decided to go around the back of the house to try entering through the sliding door. When Jan reached the back, she saw the sliding door was slightly open. Given that it was 4 a.m., the house was dark, and no one responded to her knocks, she became seriously worried. She tried to calm herself, thinking that Lisa might have forgotten to close the door when letting out her cats. But when Jan entered the house and walked into the kitchen, her worry only grew. Family photos of Robin and her older daughter were neatly arranged on an ironing board. These photos always hung on the living room wall, so Jan was baffled. She couldn't think of any reason why Lisa or Robin would take them down and place them like that. Moreover, the house was in disarray. Many items were scattered and broken, suggesting that something terrible had happened. Jan went upstairs to her daughter's room and was met with a heartbreaking sight. Robin was laying face down on the floor beside her bed, covered in bruises, with some of her clothing pulled down. Jan rushed to her daughter and immediately realized she was dead because her body was cold. Despite this, Jan was in shock and couldn't accept what was happening. She called an ambulance and tried to save Robin, even though deep down, she knew it was too late. As the ambulance was on its way, several neighbors were awakened by Jan's loud cries. She was overwhelmed with grief, calling for help and trying to get the attention of other complex residents. The police were first to arrive at the scene. They went upstairs to Robin's room and confirmed that she was dead. But that wasn't all. In another room, officers found the body of 32-year-old Lisa on the bed. She also had visible bruises, and both bodies were handed over to medical examiners for further examination. Detectives began their investigation and quickly found the first clues. There were several cigarette butts in the house that didn't belong to either Lisa or January. On the nightstand in Jan's bedroom, police found a set of car keys for a Toyota, which could fit a wide range of models from the 1980s. It seemed the perpetrator had either accidentally left them at the scene or did so intentionally for some reason. Detectives also concluded that the perpetrator had taken a shower after the murders to wash off the blood as it was still wet. The killer had also left his socks in the bedroom, but the police couldn't figure out why. With Jan's help, they discovered that several items were missing from the house. Lisa's driver's license, her credit cards, a checkbook, and a watch she had planned to give to her boyfriend. Notably, the watch had an engraved message from Lisa to her boyfriend, expressing her love. The selection of stolen items seemed strange to the police. The watch wasn't particularly valuable and wouldn't fetch much if resold, and the personal engraving would make it traceable. It would also be easy to track ATM withdrawals made with the stolen credit cards. So, detectives weren't quite sure why someone who committed a double murder would take these items. Regarding the photos of Robin laid out on the ironing board, detectives speculated that the perpetrator might have left this as a message either for Jan or the police. Local investigators immediately requested help from the state police, as their resources were clearly not enough for such a complex case. Forensic experts arrived at the scene and began examining the house using modern tools to find any clues. First, they determined that the perpetrator had entered the house through a bedroom window on the first floor by cutting part of the protective screen. Next, They examined Robin's bed and found some biological material on the sheets, which was sent to the lab for analysis. Although DNA testing was already in use at the time, the detectives had to wait quite a while for the results. Meanwhile, medical examiners studied the victims' bodies and determined that the cause of death for both Lisa and Robin was asphyxiation. According to the experts, the perpetrator inflicted multiple blows on them and then killed his victims using pillows. They also established that both victims had been assaulted and extracted the perpetrator's biological material from Robin's body, which was immediately sent to the lab. Experts concluded that the perpetrator had likely committed the assault after the murders. A male hair was also found on Lisa's body and was sent for analysis. While waiting for the DNA test results, the police began searching for possible suspects. They quickly got their first serious lead. Jan mentioned that for the past 3 nights she had been woken up by strange noises. She would wake up to the sound of the gate in her yard creaking and even thought someone was opening the sliding back door. However, it was dark outside, and she couldn't see if anyone was near her house. On the morning of May 9th, when it was already light out, she woke up and saw a man standing outside her window. He smiled and then disappeared from view. Jan was frightened but decided not to call the police. She didn't get a good look at the man's face and thought he might be someone from the complex as the townhouses were connected to each other. Detectives immediately began checking Jan's neighbors, not only in their complex but also in the nearby area. They investigated all the men, their alibis on the night of the murders, and requested DNA samples. Through this process, they identified 19 individuals who could have possibly committed the crime. Later, this list was narrowed down to 10 names, but the police couldn't confirm the involvement of any of them. When experts extracted DNA samples from the semen found on Robin's body, as well as from the sheet on her bed and pillow, they determined that all 3 samples belonged to the same man. However, there was no match in the FBI database and the samples did not match those provided by some of the neighbors. Not all neighbors agreed to voluntarily provide their genetic material, and soon the detectives began focusing on one of these individuals. After interviewing other neighbors, they learned that this man had been repeatedly seen peeping into windows, though he had never been formally charged. Their suspicions grew when this individual suddenly moved to another state shortly after the murders. The police investigated his potential involvement and even traveled to Missouri to speak with him, but they couldn't link him to the case. When they showed Jan a photo of this man, she said he did resemble the person she saw outside her window, but his connection to the murders remained unclear. One of the residents also reported seeing an unfamiliar car at the complex territory the day before the murders. She said the car was slowly driving between the houses and a man in a red cap was behind the wheel, but the police were unable to track him down. Detectives also attempted to check all owners of Toyota cars that matched the models for the keys found in Jan's room, but this investigation did not yield any results either. Given that the perpetrator took many of Lisa's personal items, including the watch she intended to give her boyfriend, investigators considered the possibility that the murders were committed by someone who knew her well and had personal motives. They investigated her boyfriend and tried to find any ex-partners, but no evidence linked any of them to the crime. As a result, the case stalled for months. The police continued working on it, examining new suspects and comparing their DNA with the perpetrator's sample, but each lead turned into a dead end. Jan repeatedly appealed to the public, asking for any information that might help the police identify the killer. She was also puzzled by the fact that none of her neighbors heard anything that night, even though investigators believe the murderer must have made a lot of noise. The murders of Robin and Lisa were covered on national television, which brought in hundreds of tips, but none of them led to a breakthrough. About a year after the murders, the police identified a new suspect. A 27-year-old man living in the same area confessed to killing 3 different people within a few years. He also stated that if he wasn't put in jail for the rest of his life, he would kill again. Detectives working on Lisa and Robin's case investigated him, but he was found to be unrelated to their murders. Since then, there had been no progress in the case for many years. Jan occasionally gave interviews to local media, expressing hope that one day the killer would be brought to justice. The police also stated that they had not abandoned the investigation, but they simply had no new leads. In 2005, 15 years after the murders, the case was reopened. This time, the police department allocated funding for one detective to work exclusively on the case for 6 months. However, despite all the hard work, the detective was unable to get any closer to finding the perpetrator. In the following years, there were no breakthroughs in the case, but in August 2016, everything unexpectedly changed. Police from a neighboring town located just about 6 miles from Yance complex arrested a 54-year-old man who had attacked his adult son with an air rifle. Although the son wasn't seriously injured, a law required the suspect to provide a DNA sample for their database. Once his DNA profile was in the system, detectives working on Lisa and Robin's case received the long-awaited match. The man's DNA was a perfect match with the 3 semen samples from the crime scene. The man's name was Joseph Ziller. Investigators immediately requested a direct DNA sample from him so experts could compare it directly with the 3 semen samples, which were still stored in the evidence warehouse. Since he was already in custody, his permission wasn't required, and the sample was quickly sent to the lab. After conducting the analysis, they confirmed a complete match, establishing that the semen from Robin's body in bed belonged to him. Joseph, who was 28 at the time of the murders, had a lengthy criminal record, mostly consisting of minor offenses. Police discovered that just 2 months after Lisa and Robin's deaths, he was arrested for selling stolen items and carrying an illegal firearm. He was sentenced to a short prison term, but at that time, the law did not require DNA samples to be taken from individuals convicted of those kinds of offenses. Joseph had never been a suspect in the case and had not even been mentioned in the case materials. At the time of the murders, he lived in a neighboring town and detectives were simply unaware of his existence. Shortly after receiving a match, Joseph was arrested. The prosecution announced their intention to seek the death penalty. Joseph denied his guilt, so he was placed in jail awaiting trial. Given that his life was on the line, the preparation for the trial took several years. It began on May 8, 2023, almost exactly 33 years after the murders. With multiple DNA samples tying him to the crime scene and the body of one of the victims, Joseph had little chance of avoiding punishment, and the trial was expected to proceed without any difficulties. However, no one expected how Joseph would behave. His actions and statements in court drew the attention of millions across the country. The prosecution presented its evidence, primarily based on the 3 DNA samples. The prosecutor argued that the death penalty was fully justified in this case. According to him, Joseph's actions were deliberate and he had plenty of time to change his mind. Instead, he methodically killed 2 victims, assaulted them, took some items from the house, laid out Robin's photos on the ironing board, and even took a shower. Joseph showed no signs of remorse. Since his arrest, he had nearly 7 years to confess and alleviate the suffering of the victims' families, who had been waiting for the trial to begin. But Joseph continued to maintain his innocence. When it was the turn of Joseph's lawyer to speak, he understandably could not present any significant evidence proving his client's innocence or contest the match of the 3 DNA samples. Instead, he argued that Joseph simply had no motive, suggesting that someone else committed the crime. The lawyer also claimed that based on the existing evidence, the killer must have known Jan and was trying to harm her. When Joseph took the stand, he put on quite a show. He repeatedly screamed at the jurors, the prosecutor, and even his own lawyers, hurling insults and flipping them off. When asked how his DNA ended up on Robin's bedsheet and pillow, he suddenly claimed that he had slept with her mother a few months before the incident. He added that he wasn't responsible for her not washing her bedding for months and called her a pig. Jan, who had to listen to all of this, stated that she had never seen this man before his arrest and certainly never brought him into her home. The prosecution called an expert who explained that the semen traces were clearly fresh with documented evidence to support this claim. If they had indeed been on the fabric for several months, it would have been obvious during the initial examination. Moreover, one of the samples was found in Robin's body, which completely contradicted the defendant's version. In response, Joseph hurled more insults at Jan, ignoring his lawyer's pleas to behave properly. They tried to explain that his behavior was only helping the prosecution's case, but he refused to listen. Ultimately, it took the jury only 5 hours to deliver their verdict. They found Joseph guilty of the murders, leaving the court to decide his punishment. Joseph's behavior during the sentencing phase was also quite surprising, but more on that later. After the guilty verdict, Joseph's lawyers tried to convince the court to drop the death penalty. They pointed out that Joseph had a difficult childhood with a very strict father. They also argued that Joseph suffered from mental disorders and should not be sentenced to such a severe punishment. Additionally, the defense claimed that Joseph had lost his memory in 1998 due to a motorcycle accident. However, experts who had assessed Joseph's condition over an extended period found no evidence to support these claims. In their opinion, Joseph was fully aware of his actions, capable of planning them in advance and eligible for the death penalty. In late June 2023, was brought into the courtroom for sentencing. As he walked to his seat, he beckoned his lawyer over and leaned in to say something, but instead unexpectedly elbowed his own defense attorney in the head, leading security to restrain him. Despite this dramatic turn, the lawyer chose not to press charges and continued to defend Joseph, although he couldn't protect him from the death penalty which the judge imposed. Was subsequently taken to prison, where he remains to this day. Jan, along with Lisa's relatives, thanked everyone involved for bringing closure to the case. Despite Joseph never admitting guilt, his involvement in the murders left no doubt, and both victims finally achieved justice. It's worth mentioning that in February 2024, police arrested Joseph's 32-year-old son for possessing illegal materials involving minors, and now he is potentially facing prison time. He might even end up in the same prison where his father awaits execution. The deaths of Diane and Alan Johnson shocked the peaceful community to its core. On September 2, 2003, the Blaine County Sheriff's Office received a distressing 911 call from King Richards. According to Kim, her neighbor's 16-year-old daughter, Sarah Johnson, had come running to her door screaming that her parents, 52-year-old Diane and 46-year-old Alan Scott Johnson, had been murdered. Officers and first responders were dispatched to the scene immediately. When law enforcement officials arrived, they entered the house and found a gruesome scene before them. In the bed, they found Diane with a gunshot to her head. She appeared to have been killed while she slept. The walls and the ceiling near the headboard were splattered with blood, and a fragment of skull was on the floor. On the floor next to Diane's side of the bed was the body of her husband, Alan. He was clad only in a towel, and blood was pooling beneath him. At first glance, investigators believed it was an opening shut case. It appeared to have been a case of murder-suicide. But as they looked closer at the crime scene, their opinion quickly changed. Investigators could hear the sound of water running and followed the blood trail back to the ensuite bathroom. The shower was left on. When officers turned the water faucet off, they saw blood splatter and a distinct bullet hole on the shower wall. Investigators began searching the house for more clues. On the bedroom floor was what investigators believed was the murder weapon, a .264 caliber Winston rifle. At the foot of the bed in which Diane lay dead were 2 kitchen knives. Another knife was found on their son Matt's bed. The clues at the scene puzzled investigators. There was no sign of forced entry, as it was noted that the Johnsons didn't lock the doors, a fact that only those close to the family would know. The house hadn't been ransacked, as one would expect from a possible robbery gone wrong. Officers at the scene questioned Sarah as to what she remembered before she ran to her neighbor's house for help. She explained to investigators that she'd been asleep when she heard a gunshot. She ran to her parents' bedroom and called out for her mother, and that was when she heard a second gunshot. Without hesitation, Sarah ran to her neighbor's house for help. She didn't see the intruder. The statement was corroborated by the neighbor who called 911, Kim Richards. On the property was a guest house which had been rented out to a close friend of Alan's, 45-year-old Mel Spiegel. Investigators entered the house and found a rather incriminating piece of evidence on the bed: the scope belonging to the same rifle found at the crime scene. However, Mel was nowhere to be found. His convenient disappearance had made him a possible person of interest for investigators. The entire property was sealed off on the orders of lead investigator Sergeant Walt Femling. He also told officers to stop the waste disposal truck from removing any trash cans from the property. The theory was that Mel may have had an altercation with Alan and Diane and killed them in the heat of the moment. As they worked through this theory, Renchick's team searched through the trash cans and discovered even more evidence. Inside, they found a pink bathrobe that had been bundled up. Once crime scene technicians opened the bathrobe, they found a latex glove, single brown leather glove that matched the one found in the Johnsons' bedroom, and ammunition for a .25 caliber gun. All the evidence was tied and sent off for DNA testing while investigators developed their own scenario. It was now becoming clear to investigators that whomever killed the couple knew about the unlocked doors and the day the trash was removed. It was possible the killer threw the evidence in the trash before fleeing the scene. It was time to call in Mel Spiegel. Hours after the double homicide, sheriff's deputies received news that Mel Spiegel had been found in Boise, Idaho. Mel agreed to speak with investigators and met them at the police station in Boise. Investigators asked Mel about his whereabouts that morning. Mel said he spent the weekend with his family and was planning to return to Bellevue in a week. Investigators contacted Mel's family members, who confirmed his alibi. Mel was asked about his relationship with Alan and Diane. He told officers that he'd been renting the guest house from the couple for years, and he showed a very good and close relationship with them. When asked about the rifle used in the murders, admitted that it did belong to him. However, he said it had been locked away in his closet before he left for Boise over the weekend. Investigators then asked Mel about anyone he believed that may have made enemies with the couple. Mel revealed that Alan and Diane were starting to grow worried about their daughter, Sarah. She'd started dating and thanking the old boy named Bruno Santos. From what Mel had heard, Bruno was living in the country illegally and selling drugs to make a living. It was a bit of a stretch for investigators, but now urged them to speak to other family members. Investigators did just that and started to put together a picture of the Johnson family. Alan and Diane met in the early 1980s. Diane had been in a relationship before meeting Alan and had a toddler son named Matt. The pair married in 1983, and Alan adopted Matt as his own son. They moved into a beautiful home in the quiet city of Bellevue, Idaho, and in making 87, welcomed their daughter Sarah Marie Johnson into the world on January 25, 1987. Alan was the co-owner of a landscaping firm in Bellevue, and Diane worked as a tax collector. Together, they'd made a beautiful home for their 2 children and were, by all accounts, a loving family. The couple were also well known in their community, as Alan was an avid trap shooter, common pastime for many in the community. In 2003, their family life had seemed harmonious to outsiders. Matt, who was 22 years old at the time, was away studying at the University of Idaho in Moscow, Idaho. Sarah had also been doing well at school and was part of her school's volleyball team. She was also the apple of Alan's eye. But investigators were about to uncover the family tensions that had started arising in the previous few months. Having cleared mail was a possible suspect. Investigators now took his advice and returned to Bellevue to speak with family members. As expected, everyone knew the Johnsons to be a happy and loving family. Investigators interviewed their son, Matt, who had returned from the university, as well as Diane's sister and brother-in-law, Linda and Jim Faveld. All 3 said that the family life appeared to be happy and normal. That was until Sarah met Bruno Santos. Matt, Linda, and Jim all agreed that Sarah dating Bruno had become a major point of contention in the family. Over the few months leading up to the murder, tensions had gotten worse within the household. But being a teenager, Sarah naturally rebelled against her parents. Even when her parents forbid Sarah from seeing Bruno again, she continued to defy them. However, Jim revealed information to the investigators that could possibly have given Bruno a reason to murder Diane and Alan. Days before the murders, Alan and Diane had discovered that Sarah had been lying about spending the night at a female friend's house. Sarah had spent the night with Bruno instead. Alan called Jim and told him what happened. Alan then asked Jim to come with him to confront Bruno. Jim told investigators that Alan was furious and threatened to report Bruno to police for assaulting Sarah as she was underage. The 2 men then left with Sarah. A charge of such a serious nature could spell deportation for Bruno. After listening to what Jim had revealed, investigators believed that this was motive enough for Bruno to eliminate the Johnsons. It was time to speak to Bruno Santos. County police were familiar with Bruno Santos. He was a high school dropout and had been involved in a few minor drug-related crimes. When he was taken in for questioning, he became confrontational with investigators. During his interview, he was arrogant and hurt to deal with, according to investigators. He then told investigators that he proposed to Sarah and that she'd accepted. Investigators believe that he'd said this to prove that he loved Sarah and wouldn't have done anything to jeopardize their relationship. When investigators asked him about his whereabouts on the morning of the murders, Bruno said that he was asleep on the couch at his home. He told officers to contact his mother, who confirmed that she'd been at home with him. For investigators, this was still not a strong alibi. When investigators asked Bruno about Alwyn and Diane, his attitude towards the Johnsons was obvious. He wasn't a fan of the couple. Back at the Johnsons' house, forensic teams were collecting evidence from the entire home. They'd used a UV light to comb through every part of the house for possible blood evidence that could indicate an escape route taken by the killer. While searching Sarah's room, they found blood splatter and bone fragments on a wall in Sarah's room. This discovery only added to the mystery of the shooting. The blood and bone were sent to the lab for testing. This discovery had investigators questioning if Sarah was being honest about what she really saw that morning. The search of the room led investigators to even more evidence. A single brown leather glove, the same one that was found bundled up in the trash. A key to the guest house and unspent .264 caliber shells were also found in Sarah's room. On one of the unspent shells was tissue matter, possibly transferred from the glove when the killer tried to hide evidence. This too was sent to forensics for testing. Investigators now believe that Bruno may have killed Sarah's parents and went to her to help him get rid of the evidence. Investigators served Bruno and his mother with a search warrant to collect evidence from the house. All the clothes he worn that day, including his shoes, were taken in for testing. His fingerprints were also taken to test against any found of the crime scene. Bruno was taken to the hospital where a DNA sample was taken for testing. Hair clippings and hand scrapings were also collected for evidence. Bruno was announced as the prime suspect in the murders of Alan and Diane Johnson. However, investigators were about to receive information that was going to take the investigation in a completely unexpected direction. Having thoroughly tested the clothes and shoes taken from Bruno, forensic experts couldn't find any trace of blood belonging to either Diane or Alan. At the actual crime scene, there were no traces of DNA, hairs, or fingerprints found anywhere near the bodies of Alan or Diane, nor was there any physical evidence that placed Bruno in the couple's room. The tests done on the gloves and bathrobe also came back with a negative result. Investigators were stumped. They were sure that Bruno had the most reason to kill both Alan and Diane. However, the complete lack of physical evidence that should have placed Bruno at the scene suggested he was telling them the truth. Bruno was eventually eliminated as a suspect in the case. As they looked at the case closely, their minds started to shift to someone else. Investigators began questioning Sarah's family and friends more intentionally about her home and personal life. They come to discover that Sarah had been prescribed antidepressants and that her relationship with her parents was rocky at best. Family members said that they brushed off her behaviors being normal for a teenager. Sarah, they believed, was at the age when most children start to become rebellious and push against their parents, but Linda, Sarah's aunt, started to grow suspicious with her niece's behavior. She told investigators that Sarah was not going through the normal grieving process. Linda said that Sarah showed more interest in returning to school and her friends than taking in to deal with the loss of both of her parents. Investigators then turned to some of Sarah's friends and asked them about her behavior since the death of her parents. They all agreed that Sarah was acting indifferent to the murders. They also told investigators that she seemed more interested in getting her nails painted. The one thing that stood out for them, though, was Sarah being more concerned for Bruno since his arrest. It was odd to them that Sarah was concerned rather than angry with her parents' alleged killer. Investigators didn't want to believe whether thoughts were taking them, as it was too horrible to imagine. But they had no choice except to look into Sarah as a possible suspect. The Johnsons' home was still an active crime scene, and now investigators were treating Sarah's room as a second area of interest. Investigators of the scene were now questioning how the blood splatter had reached that far. A gun expert was called to the house to take a closer look at the spatter pattern. After analyzing the direction from Alan and Diane's room to Sarah's, the gun expert concluded that both bedroom doors were open at the time of the shooting. Investigators had also called plumbers to the scene after clogging was reported in one of the bathroom toilets. The source of the clog appeared to be a shower cap. Investigators decided to interview Linda, Matt, and Mel Spiegel regarding some of the evidence they discovered. Matt and Linda both identified the pink bathrobe as belonging to Sarah. Mill confirmed that Sarah had a key to the guest house and often helped him clean up the place. He also told investigators that Sarah was aware of the gun that was kept in the closet. Investigators now needed to be able to link Sarah to all the evidence. But that was going to prove difficult, as eyewitnesses on the morning of the murders said that Sarah didn't have any traces of blood on her when she ran to a neighbor's house begging for help. This was also confirmed by forensics experts who used a luminol to test for any blood splatter on Sarah's clothes and found nothing at all. Investigators issued a warrant to confiscate and test the clothes Sarah had been wearing in the morning. Meanwhile, investigators wanted to speak to Sarah again and see if her story had changed since they'd last spoke to her. Investigators once again called Sarah in for an interview. She'd been staying with her aunt and uncle. Small inconsistencies were noted in Sarah's story. Overall, investigators found that her story had changed at least 5 different times. In some explanations, she said she was asleep and woke up to the sound of a gunshot. In another, she said she'd been awake when she heard the first gunshot. Another time, she told investigators that she was still in her room when she heard the second gunshot, but once again changed her story and said she was outside her parents' bedroom when the second shot was fired. Sarah also had a hard time to remember if her parents' room door was open or closed at the time of the shooting. Investigators remained calm when questioning Sarah to avoid her picking up on their suspicions. They'd already been made aware that both bedroom doors were open, and that was the only explanation for the blood splatter on Sarah's bedroom wall. Sarah was asked to submit a DNA sample, hair samples, and hand scrapings as part of the investigation to clear her name. These were all sent for testing to the lab. The pajama top and bottom that Sarah was using on the morning of the murders were sent to the lab to be tested by forensic specialist Rod Englert. Under a high-powered microscope, Englert found no traces of blood on the front of the robe. However, on the back of the garment, he found patterns of high-velocity blood splatter. He also found blue cotton fibers and green specks of paint on the inside of the robe that matched the shirt worn by Sarah that morning. But the smoking gun moment was yet to come. Lab results had also confirmed that Sarah's DNA was found on the inner lining of the latex glove and gun residue on both pairs of the brown leather glove. The blood found on the gloves and robe belonged to both Alan and Diane. This was more than enough for investigators to arrest and charge Sarah with the double homicide of Alan and Diane Johnson. On October 29, 2003, Sarah Johnson was arrested for the murders of her parents, Pellin and Diane Johnson. She was held without bail at the Blaine County Jail awaiting trial. The story of a teenage girl murdering her parents made headlines nationally and became a media sensation. Investigators and prosecutors had to develop a plausible argument that showed Sarah was motivated and capable of committing such a heinous crime. Relying on statements from family members and friends of both Sarah and her parents, they started to put together a twisted tale of a teenager in the throes of passion. Since Sarah had started dating Bruno, her parents had disapproved of the relationship. As a result, Sarah started to sneak around behind her parents' backs and acted out as any normal teenager would. However, the trigger for Sarah happened a few days before the murders. She'd lied to her parents about staying with a friend when, in fact, she was staying with Bruno. Her father's threats to have Bruno charged with assault and deported to Mexico pushed Sarah over the edge. Investigators and prosecutors believe that this was the moment Sarah had concocted the plan to get rid of her parents and live a happy life with Bruno. Being a fan of true crime and murder mysteries, Sarah believed that she had the perfect plot in place. On the morning of the murders, she got up and went to the guest house to retrieve the rifle. She then put on latex gloves, leather gloves, a shower cap to avoid blood splatter on her hair, and her bathrobe backwards to avoid any blood touching her clothes. Sarah then went to her parents' room when she heard her father get into the shower. She shot Tanya in the head while she slept. Sarah then heard her father, Alan, call out and open the bathroom door and shot him in the chest. After committing the murders, she placed knives in the bedrooms to stage the scene as if an intruder killed her pants. She then bundled up the evidence and threw it away in the trash, knowing the waste disposal company would pick up the evidence before investigators could find it. However, that didn't go to plan. Added to that, she didn't take into account the evidence that would be found in her room and the shower cap that had gotten lodged in the plumbing system. The evidence against Sarah was glaring, and it was time to go to trial. In February 2005, 2 years after her parents' murders, her defense team argued that Sarah was innocent and that her parents were murdered by an intruder. The prosecution were ready with their argument. They presented the court with the physical evidence found at the crime scene and testimonies from family and friends that showed Sarah's behavior was strange since her parents were both killed. Most damning of all was the testimony of Bruno Santos, who not only wanted to clear himself of the murder at the trial, but provided the jury with evidence of Sarah's state of mind before the murders. Bruno testified that he and Sarah had agreed to get married, and Sarah had even told them that they could live in a big beautiful house and be happy with just each other. Bruno also told the court that Sarah always spoke about how much she hated her dad and talked about shooting him. After 5 weeks of testimonies, proof of evidence, and crime scene explanations, the jury had come to a decision on March 16, 2005. Sarah, aged 18, was found guilty of 2 counts of first-degree murder. She was sentenced to life in prison without parole to the Pocatello Women's Correctional Center in Idaho. Sarah has since made several appeals to have her life sentence reduced. However, all her appeals have been denied, and she still remains in custody. Following Sarah's sentencing, the remaining family members have spoken out publicly about their feelings towards Sarah and her actions. The deaths of Alan and Diane have devastated their family entirely. The majority feel that Sarah was at fault and deserve the punishment she received. Sarah's brother, Matt, believed that Sarah showed no remorse for murdering their parents. He said that if she were ever given a second chance, she'd do a better job with the murders to avoid being caught. Pat Dishman, Diane's mother, spoke to Sarah during her sentencing hearing. She told her granddaughter that they still loved her, but that her actions had devastated their entire family. Owen's sister, Lynn Morell, said that Sarah was spoiled and rotten, and was capable of murdering another person if she was ever released. She asked the judge to consider never releasing her from prison. Today's case was one of a truly twisted and disturbing nature. To be capable of murdering one's own parents proved that Sarah Johnson only thought about herself and not of the devastation she caused for her brother and family. While they're left behind to pick up the pieces, Sarah remains behind bars for her senseless crime. Melissa Trembley was born on March 1, 1977 in Lawrence, Massachusetts. When she was just a month old, her biological parents gave her up for adoption, and she was adopted by Jeanette and Robert Trembley. Melissa grew up in the nearby town of Salem, New Hampshire. She was a very energetic child who loved fashion, singing, and had a passion for reading from a young age. Melissa had many friends at school, spent a lot of time at the Boys and Girls Club of America. When she was 9, her adoptive parents divorced, and her father hasn't been involved in her life since. Sometime later, her mother started dating another man named Robert, but he didn't live with them. On September 11, 1988, when she was 11, her mother took Melissa to Lawrence, where she was supposed to meet Robert. They often spent time at a local bar, and Jeanette frequently took Melissa along because she had no one to leave her with. Usually, her mom would let Melissa play outside since she got bored sitting with them. Jeanette always told her not to go far, so Melissa spent time on the nearby streets. Because her mom went to this bar quite often, Melissa made friends with other kids in the area and would occasionally play with them. That day, Melissa spent most of her time outside, checking in with her mother now and then. During one of these visits, the bartender made her some popcorn. Melissa said she'd come back for it soon and left, but she never returned to the bar. Around 4 p.m., her mother started to worry since Melissa had been gone for a while. She went outside and checked her car, but Melissa was nowhere to be found. She and Robert began searching for her, going street by street, but they couldn't find Melissa. They searched the area for several hours, and around 9 p.m., Jeanette decided to call the police. Officers immediately joined the search, but they also couldn't find any traces of her. By then, it was already dark. It made their task much more difficult, but the police continued searching for Melissa late into the night. They also considered the possibility that she might have run away, but her mother insisted that Melissa was afraid of the dark and didn't like being alone, so she would never have run off. The next day, Melissa's whereabouts were still unknown. The search continued. This went on until about 3 p.m. when a railroad worker called the police. He had been conducting a routine inspection of an old rail yard just a few hundred yards from the bar. The yard was quite large, with up to 8 tracks in its widest section, although some of them hadn't been used in a long time. There were a lot of empty boxcars, and between 2 of them, the worker noticed something unusual. When he got closer, he realized it was a human body and immediately called the police. Detectives arrived at the scene and quickly identified the body as Melissa Trembley. Aside from the fact that she had been reported missing since the previous morning, there was a card with her name from the Boys and Girls Club in a purse found near the body. Melissa's body was lying on tracks that were still in use, and one of her legs had been severed. The detectives believe this likely happened due to a passing train, since the section of track was still active. However, they immediately doubted that this was the cause of death. The lead detective noticed several details that contradicted this theory. Melissa's purse, containing the card with her name, was found almost 20 yards from the body. This seems strange, as it was unlikely that a train accident could have thrown the purse so far. The detective also noticed a large number of footprints and drops of blood near the purse. This led him to suspect that Melissa might have been attacked there, and only then her body was moved to the tracks. The assailant might have hoped to make it look like she died in a train accident. Another factor pointing to foul play was the location itself. The old rail yard, with its numerous empty boxcars, was a known hangout for homeless individuals and those looking for secluded spots to use illegal substances. So the detectives considered the possibility that some of them might have attacked Melissa. Her body was sent to medical examiners, while the police began searching for clues. Since no useful evidence was found at the scene where Melissa was discovered, investigators focused on finding witnesses to piece together the timeline of events. First, they spoke with an employee of the railroad company. He mentioned that the day before the body was found, he saw a girl fitting Melissa's description near the tracks. He told her to leave immediately because it was unsafe for children to be there, and she left the area. Next, the police found a woman living not far from the bar. She said she had known Melissa for several months because her children had become friends with Melissa, and she often visited their house. On that day, Melissa had come over to invite her children to play, but the woman told her they were grounded and couldn't go out, so Melissa left alone. Investigators soon found another witness who provided the first significant lead. He reported seeing a girl resembling Melissa standing next to a van at an intersection near the rail yard, talking to the driver. The witness described this man as rather large, unkempt, around 30 years old, with dark hair and a large beard. The van was brown, old, and rusty. The police considered that this man might be connected to the murder, and started searching for similar vehicles. Meanwhile, the medical examiners finished their report and confirmed that the train was not the cause of death. Melissa's body had numerous bruises and 3 fatal stab wounds. No signs of sample assault were found, and there were no foreign biological samples on her body or clothing. The experts determined that the stab wounds were inflicted with the left hand, suggesting that the perpetrator was likely left-handed. The case was reclassified as a homicide, and detectives focused on finding the killer. However, they still had only one lead: the description of the van seen near Melissa shortly before she disappeared. The police concentrated on finding similar vehicles in the area, but repeatedly hit dead ends. The challenge was that even if they found the right van, linking its owner to the murder would be nearly impossible without a confession. The DNA analysis was not yet in use, and there were no additional pieces of evidence, like Melissa's belongings or fingerprints, likely to be found in the van. The police also kept trying to find new witnesses. They interviewed several hundred residents in the area, but this effort yielded no results. Detectives continued searching for the van and other clues for several months, but the case eventually went cold. Melissa's murder received significant media coverage, and many people began blaming her mother for what happened. They were outraged that Jeanette let her 11-year-old daughter wander the streets alone, especially near such a dangerous place as a rail yard. What infuriated them even more was that while Melissa roamed the streets for hours unattended, her mother was drinking in a bar. Rumors began spreading in the newspapers that Jeanette had developed a drinking problem after her divorce and was struggling with her parental responsibilities. People also started blaming social services for failing Melissa by not intervening in the situation. Amid all these accusations, Jeanette refused to speak with media or answer their questions. When reporters reached out to Child Protective Services, they stated they were aware of the family's complicated situation and had tried to take some measures. But revoking Jeanette's parental rights had never been considered. Since then, there had been no progress in the case. Police repeatedly reviewed it and examined potential suspects, but this yielded no results. In 2000, 12 years after the murder, investigators identified their first potential suspect, Tommy Lynn Sells. He confessed to 22 murders, and investigators in Melissa's case found that many details of his crime closely matched those of her murder. Moreover, Tommy resembled the van driver seen with the girl, and he often spent nights in empty boxcars while traveling across various states. Detectives began investigating his possible involvement in Melissa's murder, but they eventually concluded that he was unlikely to be responsible. They couldn't find any evidence placing Tommy near Lawrence at that time. Instead, they determined he was probably in another state. The case remained cold for several more years until 2013, when detectives unexpectedly obtained a new lead. They arrested a man from Lawrence for an unrelated case, and during questioning, he suddenly claimed to know some details about Melissa Trembley's murder. The man said that in 1988, when he was just 13, he used to steal cars for a living. He spent a lot of time on the streets looking for suitable vehicles, and on the day Melissa disappeared, he saw a girl resembling her. She was sitting on the steps of that same bar, and next to her was a man named Mike. The witness knew Mike, but his family had warned him to stay away from that man because of his questionable reputation. The boy walked past them, and about 10 minutes later, on his way back, he saw the girl leaving the bar with Mike. At some point, another man, whom the witness didn't recognize, approached them, and the three of them continued walking together. The police asked the witness why he had remained silent for 25 years. He replied that at the time, he didn't want any unnecessary contact with the police. However, when he learned about Melissa's murder and realized he might have seen her, he asked his brother if he should tell someone, but he advised him to stay quiet. However, the detectives immediately found a serious contradiction in the story. According to the witness, he saw the girl on the bar steps when it was already dark outside, but Melissa was reported missing around 4 p.m. when it was still daylight. Given that all the bar patrons and staff were aware of her disappearance and her mother had been searching for her for hours, the detectives found it highly unlikely that Melissa could have been right outside the bar without being noticed. The police considered the possibility that the witness had either seen a different girl or his account was inaccurate. Despite this, they investigated Mike for potential involvement, but made no progress. Nevertheless, the witness's story brought renewed attention to the old case, and in 2014 it was reopened. By then, DNA analysis was widely used, and the police hoped that experts could find some new clues by re-examining all the available evidence. They examined Melissa's clothing and other items but found no foreign DNA. However, there was something else among the evidence. Samples taken from under Melissa's nails, collected in case she had scratched her attacker. The experts analyzed these samples and indeed found traces of foreign skin, which were promptly sent to the lab. But there was a new problem. Experts were able to extract a DNA profile of an unknown male, but it was only partial. It wasn't enough to get a match in the database, but the investigators were determined not to give up. Sometime later, they reached out to a company specializing in genetic genealogy. The company analyzed the sample and began searching for potential matches in available databases. This was a challenging task because they had to work with a partial profile, which made it impossible to identify the person with absolute certainty. Nevertheless, through meticulous work, they managed to find a possible distant relative of the sample's owner in the databases. This led them to a specific family with the last name McClendon. Detectives began investigating the members of this family, trying to determine who might have committed the crime. This process took several years due to the primary challenge, the lack of a complete DNA profile to definitively prove the guilt of any family member. Therefore, investigators carefully examined who among them could have been in Lawrence in 1988, matched all the criteria like age and so on. Eventually, they focused on two brothers, one of whom was Marvin McClendon. Marvin lived in Alabama, but investigators discovered that in the late 80s, he lived just 20 minutes away from Lawrence and worked as a carpenter. Digging into Marvin's past, they learned that he frequently visited a church located just a few hundred yards from the bar where Melissa was last seen. Marvin had also worked as a prison guard for about 30 years, but with breaks, one of which occurred in 1988. The intriguing findings didn't stop there. Police found that Marvin owned an old brown van during those years, which he used for work. Despite this, Marvin had no criminal record. Aside from numerous traffic fines for not wearing a seatbelt, he had been married twice, but both wives had left him. He had two sons from his first marriage, but was not actively involved in their lives. Finally, Marvin was left-handed, unlike all his close male relatives. While detectives were investigating this suspect, Melissa's mother passed away in 2015 at the age of 70. She had struggled with a severe illness for a long time and never out who killed her daughter. After gathering all the information on Marvin and checking his other relatives, detectives concluded that he was the most likely perpetrator. In 2021, they went to Alabama to question him about that time in the late 80s. Eventually, they brought up the murder of Melissa Trembley, and Marvin claimed he had nothing to do with it. When told that DNA from one of his close relatives was found on the victim, Marvin suggested that the killer might be his brother. That same year, Marvin voluntarily provided his DNA sample, but experts still couldn't establish a complete match. The partial profile from under Melissa's nails only indicated that Marvin was either closely related to the killer or was the killer himself. However, investigators who had already examined all his close male relatives knew that none of them could have committed the crime, leaving Marvin as the prime suspect. They also understood that without a full DNA match, it would be extremely challenging for the prosecution to secure a conviction. As a result, they spent another year trying to find any additional clues. Detectives also checked Mike, the man whom the 13-year-old boy claimed to have seen with a girl resembling Melissa on the bar steps. After obtaining his DNA sample, experts determined that it didn't match the skin particles found under the victim's nails, ruling him out. As a suspect, they visited Marvin several times, asking him various questions, and in April 2022, they finally decided to arrest him. Despite his continued claims of innocence, Marvin allegedly made a suspicious remark during his arrest. He told one of the officers, "At least I got to enjoy 20 years of my pension." Marvin, who was 74 years old at the time, was sent to jail awaiting trial. The judge had to place him under constant protection because other inmates quickly learned about his charges and the fact that he had worked as a prison guard. Without conclusive evidence, the prosecution relied on a process of elimination. DNA from someone in Marvin's family was found under the victim's nails, but none of his close relatives had the opportunity to commit the crime. As for distant relatives, a match with their DNA would be less evident and experts could easily see the difference. They also pointed out that in 1988, Marvin frequently visited a church on the same street as the bar, owned a similar van, and matched the description given by a witness who saw a girl near his vehicle. The trial began in December 2022. Marvin's lawyer immediately focused on the lack of a complete DNA profile of the perpetrator, claiming that without it, his client's guilt couldn't be confirmed. The defense then called two experts. One was a forensic specialist who testified that, based on crime scene photos, she couldn't confirm that the killer was indeed left-handed. The other was a genetics expert who argued that a partial DNA match with one family doesn't rule out the possibility of it belonging to distant relatives, as any person can have hundreds or thousands of them. Marvin declined to testify in his defense, and by the end of December, the jury began their deliberations. It took them almost a week, and December 27th, they reported being unable to reach a unanimous decision. Some jurors felt that without a complete DNA profile, they couldn't definitively convict Marvin, leading the judge to declare a mistrial. In early 2024, the prosecution announced plans for a retrial set to begin on September 30th, 2024. Until then, Marvin will remain in jail. Considering that he is 76 years old now, suffering from multiple health issues, there's a possibility he might not survive until the end of the new trial. If the court fails to convict him again, Marvin could be released, leaving Melissa's murder unresolved, and we may never learn the truth. Thank you for joining us on this journey into the depths of unsolved mysteries. Cold cases not only challenge our understanding of the past, but also ignite our curiosity and determination for answers. Remember to subscribe to stay updated on our latest investigations. And if you have any information regarding the cases we've covered, don't hesitate to reach out. Together, we can shed light on the shadows of the past and bring closure to those who seek it. Until next time, stay vigilant, stay curious, and never stop seeking the truth.